The mansion stood tall, grand, and untouchable on the edge of the city, guarded by gates that seemed to keep the world away. Inside lived a man named Daniel Carter, a millionaire known for his ruthless business decisions, his wealth that seemed endless, and his silence that intimidated everyone around him. To the outside world, he had it all: private jets, luxury cars, priceless art. But behind those golden walls was a loneliness no one dared to speak of. Daniel was a man who had buried his emotions years ago, after life had taken from him the one thing money could never buy back: his wife. Since her passing, he raised his little daughter, Emily, but never truly learned how to fill the void she left. He provided her with everything material, every toy, every book, every comfort, but love was something he gave in silence, hidden behind his stern face. One evening, after another long day of corporate meetings and phone calls, Daniel came home, his head pounding from numbers and strategies. He loosened his tie, poured himself a glass of wine, and sat in the dimly lit living room, too tired to even climb the grand staircase. But then, a sound drifted down from upstairs, a sound so delicate, so pure that it froze him in place. Laughter, not just laughter, but Emily's laughter, ringing like bells through the halls of the cold mansion. It was rare. His daughter rarely laughed like that anymore, not since her accident 2 years ago that had left her unable to walk without support. That laughter carried something else with it. Music, a soft tune played on the old piano that hadn't been touched since his wife's death. Curious, almost trembling, Daniel stood and climbed the staircase slowly, as if afraid the sound would vanish if he moved too quickly. At the top, he paused, and what he saw melted the walls around his heart in an instant. There, in the golden light of Emily's room, his young daughter sat on the edge of her bed, her braces leaning against the wall, her fragile legs tucked beneath her. Standing beside her was the housemaid Maria, a woman of simple background, holding her hands as the two of them danced in a circle without ever leaving the bed. Emily laughed so hard she almost fell back, and Maria laughed with her, spinning her like a ballerina in the safety of that little world they had created. For a moment, the pain of disability didn't matter, the emptiness of the house didn't matter, the wealth outside those walls didn't matter. All that mattered was that scene: a daughter finding joy, giving her heart, and a father standing in the shadows, realizing he had been blind for so long. Daniel's throat tightened, and his eyes, usually so cold, blurred with tears he hadn't allowed himself in years. He had built towers of steel and glass, but he had failed to build moments like this. The scene pierced him deeper than any deal, deeper than any fortune. He stepped inside quietly, not wanting to break the magic, but Emily noticed. Her laughter stopped for a second, her face shy. "Daddy," she whispered, unsure if she was in trouble. But instead of the stern reply she expected, Daniel knelt by her bed, kissed her forehead, and said in a voice trembling with emotion, "You look so happy, Emily. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The little girl threw her arms around him, and for the first time in years, Daniel held her not as a fragile child to be protected, but as the heartbeat of his world. That night marked the beginning of change. But change, as Daniel would learn, was never easy. Emily's disability meant constant therapy, hospital visits, and moments of pain that no amount of money could erase. Maria, the maid, became more than an employee. She became the bridge between father and daughter. She taught Daniel the simple ways to connect with Emily. Painting together, reading her bedtime stories, dancing in the small ways she could. But with every step closer to his daughter, Daniel found himself battling his greatest challenge, his own guilt. He realized how much time he had wasted drowning in business meetings while his little girl had been waiting upstairs, needing not his money but his presence. Challenges began to pile up. The company he ran faced a crisis when an investment failed, and Daniel was pressured to return to his ruthless ways, to spend nights away from home repairing his empire. At the same time, Emily's condition worsened after a fall that left her bedridden for weeks. Daniel was torn. His empire demanded him, but his daughter's fragile hand in his reminded him of what truly mattered. For the first time in his life, he chose love over power. He missed meetings. He ignored calls. His board of directors grew restless, but Daniel stayed by Emily's side, holding her through sleepless nights, telling her stories, reminding her that she was not alone. It was a battle between the man he used to be and the father he was becoming. There were moments when Daniel broke down in private, moments when he looked at Maria and asked in a whisper, "Do you think I can make it right after all this time?" And Maria, steady and kind, always replied, "You don't need to be perfect. She doesn't need a millionaire. She just needs her father." Those words became his anchor. Months passed, and though Emily's body was fragile, her spirit grew strong. She learned to play piano with Maria, and together they filled the mansion with music and laughter. Daniel began to sit with them, clapping along, even daring to sing off-key, something he once thought beneath him. Slowly the house transformed. No longer just walls of wealth, it became a home of warmth. The final test came when Daniel had to make the hardest choice of his career. His company was on the verge of collapse unless he devoted every waking hour to save it. Investors begged him, lawyers warned him, But Emily's next surgery was scheduled for the same week. He stood at a crossroads, fortune or family. The old Daniel would have chosen fortune without blinking. But as he looked at his daughter's trusting eyes, at the fragile girl who had taught him the true measure of wealth, he made his choice. He walked away. The company fell, but Daniel did not. For in losing his empire, he gained something far greater, the heart of his daughter, the love he had missed, and the peace he never knew money couldn't buy. Years later, people whispered about Daniel Carter, the millionaire who vanished from the world of business. Some said he lost everything. But those who truly knew the story, those who saw him pushing Emily's wheelchair through the park, laughing with her under the sun, those who heard the music from their home in the evenings, they knew the truth. He hadn't lost. He had finally won. Daniel Carter was a man whose name carried weight in every boardroom, every stock market report, and every corner of the business world where money meant power. He was the type of man people whispered about, the kind who could make or break fortunes with the stroke of a pen. His empire stretched across industries, his signature buildings gleamed in every major city, and his influence reached far beyond what most could ever imagine. Yet behind the prestige, the sharp suits, and the towering reputation, Daniel was a man who carried a loneliness so deep it was almost invisible, hidden behind the gleaming walls of his success. Wealth was his armor, business was his language, and silence was his companion. To the world, he was untouchable. But inside his grand mansion, he was just a man with memories that haunted him more than any competitor ever could. Years earlier, life had been very different. Daniel had once been a husband, deeply in love with a woman who had given light to his otherwise calculated world. She was gentle where he was hard, warm where he was cold, and she had the rare ability to make him laugh in a way no one else could. When Emily, their daughter, was born, that light grew even brighter. For the first few years, the house was alive with joy, laughter echoing through the marble halls, and Daniel, though busy with work, always tried to return home in time to hear Emily's tiny footsteps rushing toward him. But life is cruel in ways money can never prevent, and when his wife passed away suddenly, Daniel's world caved in. The man who had controlled billion-dollar deals could not control the one thing that mattered most. Her absence carved a hole inside him that nothing could fill. He became quieter, harder, consumed by work, not out of ambition anymore. But as a way to drown the silence, Emily was still there, a little girl who needed her father more than ever, but Daniel did not know how to be both protector and comforter. He loved her fiercely, but he didn't know how to show it. He bought her every toy she pointed at, filled her room with books, games, and clothes, thinking that gifts would equal presents. Yet children have a way of seeing beyond what's given to them. Emily, even at her young age, felt the absence of her father's laughter, his touch, his stories at night. The house was full of luxuries but empty of warmth, and Daniel convinced himself that by working harder, by making sure she would never struggle financially, he was being the father she needed. In truth, he was avoiding the part of himself that hurt too much to face. Then came the accident that changed everything for Emily. One careless afternoon, a simple fall left her injured in a way that forever altered her childhood. Doctors did what they could, but walking without braces or assistance became a dream slipping further away. For Daniel, this became another silent wound. He had the money to buy the best doctors, the finest therapies, but none of it restored what she had lost. And though he stayed by her hospital bed in those first frightening days, once she was home, he slipped back into his old pattern, retreating into work, into meetings, into anything that distracted him from facing the sight of his daughter struggling. He told himself it was strength, that he was working for her future, but deep down it was fear. Fear of failing her in the one way he couldn't cover with money. Fear that he didn't know how to make her smile again. The mansion grew quieter. Emily's laughter, once so frequent, became rare. The staff went about their duties in hushed tones, respectful of the sadness that lingered in the air. Daniel became a figure who passed through his own home like a ghost, always moving, always planning, but never stopping long enough to notice what was truly missing. Nights were the hardest. He would sit in his vast living room with the city skyline glowing through the windows, a glass of expensive wine in his hand, and wonder how he could feel so empty when he had everything the world envied. He remembered the way his wife used to sit by the piano, the way Emily used to climb onto her lap, the way music once filled the house. Now the piano sat untouched, covered in dust, just another relic of a life he could never get back. It was not that Daniel didn't love Emily. He did in ways he could never express. But his love was buried under layers of grief and pride. He feared vulnerability, feared showing weakness, feared that if he opened the door to his emotions, the pain of his wife's absence and Emily's condition would break him beyond repair. So he chose silence. He chose the safety of work. He chose to build higher towers outside while the foundation inside his own home cracked. And in that silence, Emily grew lonelier. She was a child who needed not a millionaire, but a father who could laugh with her, cry with her, and remind her that even though her world had changed, she was still whole. Daniel's loneliness was not the kind people could see. In public, he wore confidence like a mask. At galas, he shook hands with leaders and smiled politely. In boardrooms, he commanded respect, his voice calm and precise. To his peers, he was the picture of control, the man who never faltered. But when the parties ended, when the meetings were done, and when he returned to the echoing halls of his mansion, the silence roared louder than applause ever could. He was a man with countless admirers, but no one to sit with him at dinner. A man who owned priceless paintings, but no one to share the beauty with. A man who had built an empire, yet couldn't build the one thing that mattered most. Connection with his own daughter, the staff, especially Maria, the maid, noticed. She saw Emily's longing looks toward the door when her father was late. She saw the way Daniel's eyes softened for a second when he glanced at his daughter, only to harden again as he turned back to his phone. Maria felt the imbalance, the way love was present but hidden. Trapped behind the walls Daniel had built around his heart. She never judged him, but she prayed silently that one day he would realize that money, while powerful, could never take the place of moments of laughter, of presence. And though Daniel himself couldn't admit it, deep inside, the loneliness was wearing him down, cracking the very armor he thought would keep him safe. It was on an ordinary evening, when the weight of another day pressed heavily on Daniel's shoulders, that something extraordinary began to stir. He returned home later than usual, his tie loosened, his briefcase dangling lifelessly at his side. The mansion greeted him with its usual silence, the kind of silence that was almost suffocating. He set his things down, poured himself a glass of wine, and sank into the leather chair by the tall windows. The city stretched beyond the glass, glittering like a field of diamonds, but it meant nothing to him. He closed his eyes, exhausted, trying to chase away the thoughts that gnawed at him endlessly. The silence was familiar, a companion he had learned to endure. But that night, something unusual broke it, something so fragile and unexpected that Daniel thought at first it was only his memory playing cruel tricks on him. It was laughter. Not just any laughter, but the sweet, high-pitched laughter of his daughter, Emily. The sound was faint at first, drifting down the staircase like a forgotten melody, but it grew louder, clearer, impossible to mistake. Daniel froze. It had been so long since he had heard her laugh that freely, so long since the house carried anything resembling joy. His chest tightened, and he remained perfectly still, afraid that if he moved, the sound would vanish. It was not the polite smile she sometimes gave when people tried to cheer her, not the half-hearted giggle that came when she was trying to be strong for him. This was pure, unfiltered, bubbling laughter, the kind he thought he might never hear again after her accident. It wrapped around him, filling the emptiness of the house in a way no symphony, no luxury, no achievement ever had, and it wasn't just laughter. A tune followed it, soft, careful notes on the piano. That piano, which had sat in silence for years untouched since his wife's hands last caressed its keys, was alive again. Daniel's eyes opened wide, his breath caught in his throat, as he listened to the melody weaving its way into the quiet house. Each note seemed to tug at memories long buried, memories of evenings when his wife played, when Emily would climb onto the bench beside her, clapping her tiny hands in delight. Those sounds had disappeared with her passing, replaced with silence so heavy it felt like another death. Yet here it was again, timid but real, echoing from upstairs. He felt his heart race with something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Hope. Without realizing it, Daniel stood. His glass of wine remained untouched on the table, forgotten. He moved slowly, each step up the staircase deliberate, cautious as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile miracle unfolding above. His hand slid along the polished railing, his body trembling with anticipation. Every note of ladder, every touch of music drew him higher, pulling him out of the shadows he had chosen to live in. By the time he reached the top of the stairs, his pulse was hammering, and the sound was clearer, filling the corridor with a warmth he had almost forgotten could exist within these walls. He walked toward Emily's room, each step heavier than the last, until he stopped at the doorway. And there it was, the sight that would change everything. His daughter, his fragile, brave Emily, was seated on the edge of her bed. Her braces were carefully set aside against the wall, and her small legs, so often a reminder of her limitations, were tucked beneath her. She wasn't crying, she wasn't staring blankly into space as she sometimes did when sadness consumed her. Instead, she was radiant, her cheeks flushed pink with joy, her eyes sparkling like stars. She was laughing uncontrollably, her voice ringing through the air, and standing beside her was Maria, the maid who had quietly become part of their family. Maria held Emily's hands as though they were priceless treasures, spinning her gently in a dance that required no steps, no movement across the floor. They twirled in place, pretending to leap, pretending to float, and Emily laughed so hard that she nearly fell back against the pillows. Maria steadied her, laughing too, both of them lost in a moment of unrestrained happiness. Daniel's throat closed. He had not expected this, had not even imagined it possible. For 2 years he had watched Emily's light dim, had watched her smile fade into something rare and fleeting. But here she was, alive again in ways he thought her accident had stolen from her forever. His eyes blurred as tears welled up unbidden, burning against the coldness he had carried for so long. He gripped the doorframe for support, unable to move forward, unable to retreat. The scene struck him harder than any loss or victory in his business life ever had. He had faced hostile takeovers, economic collapses, betrayals from men he trusted, but nothing had ever disarmed him like the sight of his daughter laughing. Like the sound of music playing in his home again, it wasn't just Emily's laughter that undid him. It was the realization of what he had missed. How many nights had she longed for a moment like this, for someone to dance with her, to remind her she was still a child, still capable of joy? How many times had he walked past her door without stepping inside, too consumed by conference calls and numbers to notice the sadness in her eyes? His chest ached with regret, the weight of it crashing down on him. But in that same moment, another feeling bloomed: gratitude. Gratitude that someone had been there for Emily when he had not. Gratitude that Maria, in her kindness and simplicity, had given Emily back a piece of her childhood, even if just for a moment. Emily suddenly noticed him at the doorway. Her laughter faltered, her eyes widened, and she froze. For a second, fear flashed across her face, as though she expected him to scold her for playing too wildly, for laughing too loudly, for forgetting the quiet sadness that seemed to define their home. Daniel's heart shattered at that look. The idea that his own daughter thought she had to hide her happiness from him. He wanted to speak, to reassure her, but his voice trembled before the words even formed. Still, he managed to step forward, slowly, carefully, his face soft in a way it hadn't been in years. He knelt beside her bed, cupped her tiny face in his hands, and whispered with a voice that cracked under the weight of emotion, "You look so happy, Emily. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Her eyes searched his uncertain at first, but then she threw her arms around his neck, clinging tightly, as though afraid he might disappear again into the world that had always taken him from her. He held her, really held her, feeling the smallness of her body, the fragility of her frame, and the strength of her spirit all at once. In that embrace, something inside him broke free, the walls he had built around his heart crumbling in silence. For the first time since his wife's death, Daniel allowed himself to feel without restraint. He allowed himself to weep, not as a businessman, not as a millionaire, but as a father who had just rediscovered the sound of his daughter's laughter. From that night onward, the image of Emily and Maria laughing together refused to leave Daniel's mind. He replayed it endlessly, every detail etched into him like a permanent mark: the golden glow of the lamp, the dusted piano that came back to life, the sound of pure joy ringing in a house that had known only silence. For years he had lived as though love could be delayed, as though providing for his daughter financially was enough, as though his absence could be excused by the size of the empire he was building. But that moment upstairs revealed a truth he could no longer ignore. His daughter was alive in ways he had failed to notice, and the happiness he thought had been lost forever could still be found if only he chose to step into it. The scene cracked something inside him, and with the crack came a flood of emotions he could no longer suppress. Daniel began to see things differently in the days that followed. Where once he would pass Emily's room with only a nod or a distracted glance, he now lingered. He sat with her in the mornings, even if only for a few minutes before leaving for work, asking her about her dreams or listening to her small stories. At night, instead of retreating to his study or pouring himself into contracts, he tried to sit with her while Maria played the piano, his heart aching and healing all at once as Emily sang softly along. It wasn't easy, not for a man who had built walls around himself for so long. The habit of silence clung to him, and sometimes he would catch himself reaching for his phone instead of meeting her eyes, slipping into the safety of work when emotions grew too strong. But each time Emily's laughter pulled him back, reminding him of what mattered. Guilt, however, shadowed his every step. He could not ignore how much time he had wasted, how many birthdays had been marked by expensive gifts but not his presence, how many nights she had gone to bed without hearing his voice because he was caught in meetings across the world. The guilt gnawed at him, whispering that he was too late, that whatever bond he might try to build now was already weakened by years of neglect. He wondered if Emily's joy in Maria's company was a reflection of what he had failed to give her, if she looked to Maria as the warmth she needed because he had been cold for too long. Yet instead of letting that guilt paralyze him, Daniel tried to let it fuel him. Each smile from Emily became a small redemption, each laugh a chance to repair what he had broken, each moment of presence a quiet step toward being the father she deserved. Maria, though humble and quiet, noticed the shift in him. She had worked in the house long enough to know its silences, to see the distance between father and daughter. She had never judged Daniel outright, but she had often wished he would open his eyes, that he would see what Emily needed from him was not another toy or another promise of the future, but a father's touch in the present. Now, watching him kneel beside Emily's bed, watching him stay longer at the piano, she saw the change and smiled softly to herself. She encouraged Emily gently to share her feelings with her father, nudging her to speak about her fears, her dreams, her small victories in therapy. And slowly, Emily began to trust that her father was listening, really listening, not just nodding with his eyes on a document, but hearing her with his heart. The challenges of Emily's disability never disappeared. The braces remained, the therapies were grueling, and her body tired quickly. There were nights when she cried in frustration, when she whispered that she was tired of trying, when she asked why she couldn't be like the other children she saw at the park. In the past, Daniel would have stood helpless at the door, unsure of how to comfort her, retreating instead into his work because it was a language he understood. But now he forced himself to sit beside her, to hold her hand and whisper the words he had kept locked away. He told her she was brave, stronger than anyone he had ever met, that every step she took, even if small, was a victory greater than any business deal he had ever won. The words did not come easily, and sometimes his voice trembled with the weight of them. But he said them, and Emily's eyes lit with a quiet trust he thought he had lost. The mansion began to change in subtle ways. It was no longer a place of cold corridors and empty rooms. Laughter returned, faint at first, then louder, more frequent. The piano was played almost every evening now, with Emily pressing keys with Maria's patient guidance, and sometimes Daniel joining in by tapping the wrong notes on purpose just to make Emily laugh harder. Mealtime shifted from solitary affairs to shared moments, with Daniel asking about Emily's day, Maria chiming in with stories, and Emily often turning red from laughing at their clumsy attempts to cook together on weekends. The walls that had once echoed with emptiness began to hum with life again, not because of wealth or grandeur, but because of the simple presence of love. Still, Daniel wrestled with the double life he lived. In the corporate world, he was still the ruthless, precise figure people respected and feared. His company was facing turbulence, investments wobbling, and competitors circling like sharks. He knew he could not afford distraction, that the slightest slip might cost him everything he had built. Yet whenever he looked at Emily, whenever he remembered that night upstairs, he knew he could not return to the man he had been. The battle between his empire and his daughter's ladder became the central conflict of his life, tearing him in two directions. There were days when he stayed too long at the office, and Emily's face fell when he returned late, and he felt the old habits creeping back in. But then he would kneel beside her bed, see the flicker of disappointment in her eyes, and his heart would ache with the reminder that his fortune meant nothing if it cost him the very reason he lived. At times, Daniel questioned whether he even knew how to be a father anymore. He was learning slowly, awkwardly, like a man stumbling in the dark, guided only by the small light of his daughter's smile. There were mistakes. Times he pushed too hard, trying to motivate her when what she needed was comfort. Times he grew frustrated when she struggled, forgetting that his frustration hurt her more than it helped. But unlike before, he no longer retreated. He apologized, stumbling over the words but meaning them with all his heart, and Emily, with the innocence of a child who loved deeply, always forgave him. Each failure became a lesson, each misstep a chance to try again, and Daniel found himself growing not as a businessman, but as a father. He often returned to that night upstairs in his thoughts, the night that opened his eyes, the night that melted the armor he had carried for so long. It was not a grand event, not a monumental achievement, but the simplest of moments, a child's ladder, a dance on the edge of a bed, a piano playing softly in the background. Yet it carried more weight than any success he had ever tasted. It reminded him that life's treasures were not measured in numbers, not in contracts, not in possessions, but in fleeting, fragile moments of joy. And it was that realization, more than anything, that kept him trying, that kept him fighting against the pull of his old self, that kept him choosing day by day to be the father Emily deserved. The days turned into weeks, and with every passing moment Daniel found himself standing at a crossroads he had never truly faced before. His company, the empire he had spent a lifetime constructing, began to show cracks. A failed investment, a sudden market shift, and the restless whispers of shareholders created a storm that demanded his full attention. His board members urged him to return to the man they knew, the one who could fight through chaos with unshakable precision, the man who could sacrifice anything and anyone for the survival of his empire. Meetings stretched long into the night, emails piled up, and pressure mounted with every headline predicting the fall of his fortune. Yet even as the business world demanded his focus, the soft voice of Emily pulled him back to the reality of his home. Emily's condition had grown more fragile in recent months. The accident had left scars not only on her body but on her spirit, and though she had fought bravely through therapy, her body often betrayed her determination. Some nights she would lie awake, crying quietly into her pillow, not wanting anyone to hear her pain, but Maria always knew. She would sit beside her, stroking her hair, whispering comfort, and sometimes singing softly until Emily drifted back into uneasy sleep. Daniel, who had once remained a distant observer in those moments, now forced himself to sit with them. He held Emily's hand, watching her fragile frame shiver under the weight of exhaustion, and in those nights the reality of his choices pressed harder than any boardroom crisis. He could save his company or he could save his daughter's childhood, but he began to see that he could no longer do both.